G'day, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the third season of the History in the Bible podcast. In this final season, I explore how the Jews and the Christians constructed new religions when they were sent spinning into the void after the destruction of the temple. All of the history about all of the books beyond the Bible. Episode 3.32 Speculations, Part 3. In my final episodes, Steve Guerra of the History of the Papacy podcast and I are mulling alternative histories. We presented our first 5 speculative scenarios in parts 1 and 2 of this series. This time, we look at 3 new scenarios. Our first diverges from our timeline in about the year 35. What if Jesus had not been executed by the Romans, but had lived on to see the Great Judean Revolt of 66 CE? What would he have made of it? Second, let's say that Jesus died when he did, a generation before the Great Revolt. But what might have happened if his chief apostles, Peter and Paul, had lived to witness the Roman attack on Judea? And third, let's move on to about the year 100, when Christians first fell under the Roman gaze. Would the church have flourished earlier and more strongly if the Roman state had never persecuted it? Okay, scenario 6. What if Jesus had lived past the Great Revolt? Now, dear listener, I admit I have got hardly any notes on this because I have absolutely no idea what would have happened if Jesus had lived past the Great Revolt. Or, okay, well, there's a theological concern. Jesus hasn't been crucified. This causes a little issue. What if he'd just carried on teaching and died naturally of old age? And then maybe he mysteriously disappeared. I mean, there's a lot of other prophets who mysteriously disappear. Does Christianity still exist?
I would have to imagine that he becomes way less of a controversial figure. I think that he really could have turned into a prophet for everyone, for all the Jewish sects. You know, if he keeps on a roll, he's doing the same thing, doing miracles. He's still controversial, kind of like an Elijah figure. He's calling out people. He's doing everything like that.
That's just what I was thinking, an Elijah-like figure.
You know, he's not making everybody happy,
no.
But...
Do you think Christianity would have survived in any form that we would recognize?
I think that Judaism itself probably would have changed. I guess, would it be, in this scenario, it's all things being equal, that there still would have been the revolts? And when would have Jesus have died? Oh, he lives past the Great Revolt, so into the 70s or maybe the 80s.
So he would be old. He'd be very old by the standards of his time. But it's possible.
It'd be kind of interesting if he died during the revolt.
Oh, ooh.
What the fallout from that would be.
That could make Christian theology even more complicated than it is now if he died during the revolt. God took his son during the revolt. Or maybe he ends up being explicitly killed by the Romans, which is just like what happened. Just happens 30 years later.
It's like one of those ones where everything's different, but then it winds up basically the same way.
That's right. It's that sort of time travel story, isn't it? Things change massively, but yet, yeah, it ends up the same. It could have ended up exactly the same.
Because I guess it would depend, Paul, or what would, a lot of the story would be is what happens in those intervening years. What does Paul do? Because Paul doesn't have his miraculous conversion story if Jesus is actually there. Or it's very different.
Good point. I mean, in our timeline, Paul is running around and telling the disciples, Jesus appeared to me, so I know just as much about him as you guys do, but my message is independent. But let's say Paul had some sort of attraction to Jesus. Yeah, but Jesus is still around, so he can actually still talk to Jesus. Oh, that'd be interesting. Jesus meets Paul. Ooh, that'd be a conversation and a half, wouldn't it?
And then if he does get killed in the revolt in a similar way of where it's a persecution and he dies, and it almost turns everything that happened in the 30s up to 11.
Yeah.
Because he has all of that time. And again, in that intervening time, we have to imagine it's a world where he's just getting better and better at it to have made it, and he hasn't been forgotten by 70 because he didn't be old at that time. Like you said, he's going to be in his 70s or 80s. If he's still a firebrand, kind of like you would imagine with Elijah.
And instead of his death being an obscure death in the 30s, executed as a criminal, if it's during the Great Revolt, as you say, the drama has turned up to 11 because he's killed in this massive public revolt.
Then you think all of the prophecies of the temple being destroyed, it's not something that happens 40 years down the road. It's happening right now.
That's true.
Which again turns the apocalypticism to the max.
Jesus actually dies during the apocalypse he foretold. Oh, that should be the real story. That would have been so much more dramatic. Maybe a bit too Baz Luhrmann dramatic.
What happens after that? So it's the dramatic end, the temple, all this talk about people are maybe by the 70s getting kind of sick of it. Oh, this, all this apocalypticism, where is it? And then boom, it actually happens. What happens after the fact?
Well, I suppose, what happened in real life? Okay, there's the apocalypse, which doesn't really happen. It doesn't diminish any Christian's belief in the second coming. Wouldn't it be about the same theologically?
It sure seems that way. Maybe just more so. It's everything that happened, but more so.
Yeah, but more so, yeah.
Everybody's just a little bit more in tune. Maybe the Romans come down with more persecution sooner.
The Romans really didn't start persecuting until after the year 100, when we have Pliny's references. But had the Christians been prominent in saying the end of the world is coming around about the year 70, persecutions would have started a generation earlier, I suppose.
Yeah, that is a very interesting one. And that, like you said, I think for this one, I only had a couple of things jotted down. But I think that could have been, I think that is a very dramatic story. If Jesus had lived and then died, and then you have the whole story basically just fast forwarded 40 years, that would have been something of a story.
We would have had a lot more parables, wouldn't we?
Yeah, that would have changed. Probably the literature would have definitely been vastly different.
It certainly would have been bigger. If Jesus was only preaching for 3-4 years, and now he's been preaching for 30 years or whatever, lots more stories to tell.
And does he go on the speaker circuit through Asia Minor into Rome? Or does he stay as a Galilean doing basically the same thing? That's an interesting thought.
In the Gospels, Jesus is never depicted as keen to leave Jewish areas, is he? I think he only moves to pagan areas, once or twice. He goes to Tyre or something, and he goes to the Decapolis. I think he would have stayed in Galilee, Judea. Paul is going on the big Gentile missions. Maybe Paul keeps inviting him to come and visit him in Greece somewhere, and Jesus never takes up the invitation. So he's like Elvis Presley. Jesus never tours overseas, in effect.
Then you get potentially the epistles of Jesus. The clubs are having all these problems, and Paul, James, Peter, they can't agree on anything. And then Jesus has a council. That really does change the equation. Or does he never, is it kind of like his ministry? In those sorts of things, he never really has to get super directly involved because the person, he's still there. So maybe it kicks the can down the road of all those conflicts to a lot of things get ironed out, but then a lot of the conflicts are still bubbling under the surface until he actually dies during the revolt.
I mean, I can see Jesus basically not stepping in to say, settle arguments between Paul and Peter, because Jesus is still delivering cryptic parables all over them. Maybe he isn't interested in it. So there's still those conflicts. I mean, that's the picture that the Gospels give. I mean, he's never viewed as like the dictator boss. Yeah, I can't see Jesus stepping in and saying, okay, Paul, you're wrong about A, B, C, and D. Shut up. Peter, let Paul talk. I can't really see that happening.
What do you think happens with the Jewish leadership, like the Sanhedrin? Is he always an outsider to that?
I would say yes. I mean, Judaism has a very long history of prophet outsiders annoying the establishment, doesn't it? And the establishment basically lets them go on because they're not really a threat. Because there were many little prophet/rebels which launched tiny little rebellions, which only lasted a couple of weeks until the Romans sent a cohort down to crush them. The Romans might have had a problem, but I don't think the temple establishment would have. But we're hypothesizing that Jesus is not killed by the Romans for any reason. Maybe they just ignore him. And there is one famous case in Josephus, I think, where the Sanhedrin brings this guy to the Romans saying, he's a danger. He's a danger. And the Roman procurator at the time says, nah, he's just a nut job. Let him go. So we do know that happened.
And that's probably what would have happened back in the 30s in this alternate. That would have been the point of departure, is that at the trial, Pilate's, hey, guys, this isn't my problem. This is your problem. This is a you thing, as they say. And this isn't a me thing. It's a you thing. And I'm not going to do anything about it. And they couldn't do anything about it.
That's true. They did not have power of life or death, did they?
Then over the course of those 30 years, he becomes the mega Elijah, Elisha, Jeremiah, all of them rolled up into one.
For whatever reasons, never regarded as a political threat to the Romans, perpetual thorn in the establishment side, and then he's killed gloriously during the Great Revolt. Actually, it would have been interesting. During the Great Revolt, would Jesus have been pro-Roman or anti-Roman?
That is a tough one. Because if he had stayed in Galilee, I don't remember what happened to Galilee during those revolts. I think the Romans moved south from Syria and they swept through Galilee and then they swept through Samaria. I wonder if he tries to stay out of it, but then the apocalyptic action clearly would have been in Jerusalem. So he goes down to Jerusalem to make his mark.
If Jesus was sensible, he would have just stayed out of it. But maybe he would have sided with the Galileans. I'm on my way to Jerusalem with you guys.
Then he gets wrapped up in trying to make peace, and the Romans get mad at him. The establishment gets mad at him, and then that's what lands you back to the original scenario.
Okay, Steve, let's move on to a variant of Scenario 6, namely Scenario 7. We're still around about the year 70. In this scenario, Jesus dies when he does die, but Peter and Paul are not persecuted by Nero, and they live either into or past the Great Revolt. Again, they would have been in their 70s, 80s. It's not impossible. The only disciple that tradition holds as surviving past the Great Revolt is really John. The fact that John lived to be supposedly 100 doesn't seem to have influenced much of either what he wrote or his reputation or anything like that.
So I guess we would assume they do everything up to the 40s, or the 60s is when they customarily, 60s. So they would have done everything that they would have done. They both go to Rome. They both preach along the way. And it's really, they just live about 3 or 4 years later, 10 years later.
I think that they're both traditionally dated to have died around about 64, something like by Nero.
Or, yeah.
So let's say they go another 10 years. Yeah, but the important thing is they live into the Great Revolt. So there's this apocalyptic thing happening. Now, supposedly both Peter and Paul are in Italy, and Paul is supposed to have gone on to Spain, but we've got no record of it.
What do you assume the point of departure is? They don't get caught up in the Nero persecution and the burning of Rome?
Yeah. The Christians are simply so insignificant, no one's ever heard of them in Rome, so they don't get blamed for anything. They're just another mystery cult. And neither Peter nor Paul attract the attention of the authorities. And like any other sort of priest of ISIS or whatever, they're just spreading the word and do so for 10 years longer.
I have to think that Paul would have probably have hit the road, so to speak, within that 10 years. I mean, he wrote in the epistle to the Romans that he was going to go to Spain. And I think that he was really hot to trot to go to Spain as soon as possible. Rome was still Peter's thing. It wasn't Paul's stomping ground, really. I mean, Peter was there before him, and so I think that he would have moved on. Maybe Paul sets himself up as the big deal, the apostle to Spain or to France or to North Africa or something.
I'd agree with that. I mean, in our timeline, all of Paul's missionary work is in Greece and Asia Minor. If he had another 10 years, he would have loved to travel throughout Spain and France and North Africa. And of course, he'd be writing letters all the time because this man loved to write. So it would have I think it would have made Christianity even more Pauline than it now. And Paul would have had more time to get his act together, to spread the word, all that sort of thing. And I wonder about the Great Revolt. We know Paul was looking forward to the end, and he thought it would happen soon. Would the start of the revolt have actually cheered Paul up? In his last letters, he does sound a bit, I thought Jesus would be back by now. If he survives to the beginning of the revolt and he says, you see, everything I said is coming true. Jesus is coming back. It's the end of times.
Then the question you have to ask yourself is, what does he think after the revolt? If he lives another 10 years, so a couple of years after the revolt, and nothing seems to really change, but that's from our perspective. Maybe he could have written it as, whoa, this is the big deal, and everything has changed now.
I think that's what would have happened. I mean, from what I understand, there are two different eschatologies in Paul's writings, and his later ones, he is saying the end of times has already begun. We are in the middle of it, although it's invisible. And I think that just would have reinforced it, I suppose.
Peter, I imagine, would have maybe he would have moved on, maybe to Carthage, or, I mean, Rome is a good of a place to land and career as any place, and he just builds up the clubs there. Then maybe he gets martyred, maybe he doesn't.
You think, I mean, if you want rich pickings, you go to Rome, wouldn't you? Maybe Peter would have gone to Rome, and maybe then he would have gone to North Africa, which did have very substantial Jewish populations, while Paul, say, goes to Spain, France.
And it probably almost becomes whatever's happening back in Jerusalem. I wouldn't say it becomes a footnote, but it's not as big of I mean, you got to figure that whatever news they're getting is a month old at that time. So that takes a lot of the edge out of things, and it gives you a chance to think about what's going on and craft the narrative.
Okay, anything else you want to say about that one?
That's a really good thought experiment, that one.
I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about. Scenario 8, we've moved on to the year 100. Now we know from the writings of Governor Pliny, in the year 100, the Roman state was becoming aware of Christians and it regarded them as pretty off. There may have been little local persecutions of Christians in the empire, but certainly nothing organised. And in fact, from the correspondence we have between Pliny and the letter Trajan, there was no attempt to conduct a systematic persecution. Trajan basically says, yeah, these guys do seem a collection of fairly offensive weirdos, but do not go out of your way to persecute them. Now, the Christians had become infamous for basically sexual outrages, wickedness, and evil deeds. The general pagan population had a fairly poor opinion of them. One author I read said that the closest you could put it to as a modern analogy is that many Romans regarded the Christians as witches. Maybe you were attracted to that sort of thing if you wanted, but otherwise not so much. But let's say that maybe there were some people in the empire who didn't like Christians and would, beat up on their neighbours every so often. But the Roman state never, ever decided to systematically persecute, or maybe even say they managed to get a better reputation amongst the locals. Maybe say even the Roman state turns them into a bona fide religion, because they did distinguish between bona fide religions and what they would call superstitious rubbish. How would that have affected the growth rate of Christianity and its future, do you think?
I think in a lot of ways that we live in the alternative universe, that Christianity was so persecuted. Because I just can't imagine why Christianity keeps getting picked on in the schoolyard so much. I can see later on, like with Diocletian, why Christianity was such a problem, because it really was shaking the foundation of the empire. The little piece of the church, that was during the early 200s, and then there was the major piece of the church, that was the
there's the persecution under Decius around about 250, I think. And then, then under Diocletian 70 years later, it was the big one.
And for that, the big piece of the church, there really wasn't, Christianity wasn't legal, but it wasn't persecuted either. It was kind of like drug laws in Europe, where they just don't enforce the laws. The laws are on the books, but you're not going to get run in for them. I think you have that situation where I think it probably, if that had happened the whole while, Christianity probably would have exploded.
We certainly know it exploded after Constantine, when it was legalized, and it exploded even more under Theodosius, when it was made basically the state religion. Yeah, maybe the explosion of Christianity would have been accelerated by 100, 150, even 200 years.
Especially in the East. But then the East didn't have those major persecutions, really. That seemed more like a Western thing for the most part.
That I'm not sure of, but yeah, the impression I get is that you're not reading about major persecutions in Greece. And I think the two major regional persecutions we know about, the martyrs of Lyon and ones in North Africa, which are dated to, I think, the late 100s. Yeah, they're definitely Western things.
It was really only the Diocletian persecution. That was the surprising thing, is that his Augustus, who was that Licinius or Maxentius? Whoever his Augustus was in the East really put the screws to the Christians, and that was the shocker. It's like, hey, we've been getting along pretty well here for a long time. I mean, even longer than the Decian persecution. And then all of a sudden, that's when Origen gets caught up and big names start getting caught up. But that was really short-lived. It was pretty intense. I know some people, like modern scholars like Candida Moss, say it wasn't that big of a deal. But if it happens to you, it's a pretty big deal. And they were the ones writing about it.
Well, I think we can conclude that had there been no systematic persecution, it would not have changed the attractiveness of Christianity. So for whatever reasons, Christianity expanded fairly quickly, I suppose, in our timeline would certainly have pertained in an alternate timeline.
I think my only refutation to that would be is if there is no persecution, if there is no stress put on them, does that make it a weaker organization? Sort of like the, evolutionary theory, where there's no stressors put on the organism, or in this case, the organization, that it becomes a little flabby and it doesn't grow as quickly because it hasn't been stressed.
Maybe the Christian organisation would have ended up fat and flabby, and it might have proved an easy target for the Manichaeans or the Mithraists or something, which we'll be discussing in later scenarios.
Or if a persecution does come down the road and there's not that core there that will stick it out because they haven't gone through anything. That happened during the Diocletian persecution. There was a lot of fair weather friends who melted off as soon as the heat got turned up.
You wouldn't have had your core of willing to die fanatics.
It makes me think of the modern day with Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses. They go door to door. It's not to convert people. That's like sending out a mailer or an email blast. You get a, 0.01% turnaround. It's to harden them, to get people slamming the doors in their faces because it gets them tightened with their community. I don't know if that's the official, behind the curtain, that's what they're saying. But Rodney Stark, the author of that book on conversion during this time period of late antiquity, that's his big theory, is that the conversions were all organic. They weren't retail. It wasn't going to a rando and saying, oh, this Christianity thing's really good. Why don't you come visit the church? It happened where the paterfamilias became Christian, and that Christianized an entire, not just the family, a nuclear family like we think of it, the familia, the slaves and the clients and all of that stuff. But then it also toughened the people, the persecutions, just like with today. If a Mormon getting a door slammed in their face isn't persecution as such of getting put on the rack or toasted over coals, but that does create some sort of bond with your fellow religionists, that it's us versus them.
Thanks for visiting. For show notes, maps, charts, and timelines, visit my website at www.historyinthebible.com. You can even download professional posters for free.